My dear niece, in your last letter, you mentioned that you were reading the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and that its inverted style and backward logic were making it difficult for you to understand the theme that Lewis is trying to convey. I will do my best to clear things up for you, and to explain what the novel is all about. Judging by the contents of your last letter, I assume that I should start from the very beginning. The novel itself contains letters from an old, experienced demon named Screwtape to his nephew, Wormwood, instructing him on how to tempt his first human subject. The letters take us indirectly through the life of a Christian, from his conversion to his death. The most prominent theme in the book, although there are many others, is that God conquers in the spiritual battle between himself and Satan. You may ask why Lewis would bother to show a theme that is so obvious to us Christians. Well, he was influenced by his life and culture, but more on that later. Also, Lewis chooses to write about this obvious theme in a new way, from the point of view of a demon. By doing this, Lewis shows us things from a new perspective and gives us a fresh look at an old truth. Lewis shows us his theme mainly through the use of artistry and texture, things that can be difficult to spot if you are not looking for them. Lewis primarily uses central focus and irony, which are elements of artistry, and point of view, which is an element of texture, to convey his theme. Before I take you into how you can see the theme through his artistry and texture, let me tell you a little about how Lewis's life and culture influenced his writing. Clive Staples Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898, in Belfast, Ireland. He grew up in the church but turned to atheism at the tender age of 13. Throughout his young adulthood, he hated all spirituality, especially Christianity. However, he was convinced in 1929 that there was a God when he was 31 years old. A few years later, Lewis's good friend and your beloved author, J.R.R. Tolkien, along with another friend of Lewis's, Hugo Dyson, convinced the reluctant man that Christianity was true. Lewis did not want this conversion, but he was convinced by logic, an event that would later influence his decision to write about his theme in an exceedingly logical way. Lewis also grew up and lived in a world of increasing Darwinism and Marxism, two movements in thinking that greatly influenced society. Darwinism is the theory that all living organisms came from a common ancestor, and Marxism is a political worldview that we now know as communism. With both of these prominent movements denying the existence of a supernatural and focusing on the self, you can see why Lewis would choose to write about the topic of supernatural conflict and the theme that God will win the spiritual war. Now that you can see why Lewis wrote about the theme he did, it is time for you to find this theme within the novel. While reading the book, you should notice that all the characters, both those for Satan and those for God that Screwtape mentions, have one singular goal. That is, to win human souls. To put it in technical terms, this is what a literary analyst would call the central focus of the book, the one thing that everything else revolves around. You can see this when at one point Screwtape says, "To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return. That is what really gladdens our Father's heart." But again he says of God, "One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life on a miniature scale will be qualitatively like his own." Lewis displays his theme through this element of artistry by showing that the demons do not win this battle, but lose the human soul at the end of the book, when the human dies and is taken to heaven. This plot choice of Lewis's displays the theme that God must win in this spiritual war, because the demons could not win the battle for one soul despite that being their only goal. In addition, you can draw a larger logical conclusion. If the demons cannot win the battle for one soul, how can they win the larger spiritual war for the whole earth? The second artistic element that Lewis uses to show his theme is that of irony. You are probably used to seeing irony used in a comedic way, as you laugh at the unsuitableness or inaptness of the situation. Lewis uses irony in his novel for humor, as well as for enhancing his theme. The degradation of it, that this thing of earth and slime, the human, could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Besides small examples of irony like the previous quote, Lewis uses it to show his theme in a large way through irony in the plot. Throughout the book, Lewis ironically makes exactly what the demons try to avoid happen. First, Screwtape tells Wormwood to keep the human from becoming a Christian. but then in the next letter, the human has become a Christian. I note with grave displeasure that your patient, human subject, has become a Christian. Then they try to lead him back to the road to hell, but whoops, he goes through a second conversion. Okay, then don't let him act on his new repentance. Whoops, he has become humble. This pattern of ironic situations continues as the human is brought closer to God, and the demons are thwarted in their plans. This once again shows the theme that God wins the spiritual war by amusingly showing the demon's inability to do anything that doesn't eventually lead the human to God. Finally, we come to one of the elements of texture that Lewis uses to convey his theme: point of view. The point of view of a story is, you guessed it, the viewpoint from which the story is told. Lewis chooses to write the Screwtape Letters from the first-person point of view, using the demon Screwtape as the narrator. Lewis not only puts the story in first person, but he also writes it from the point of view of a demon. Very few stories like this one, The Simple Life of a Christian, are told from the viewpoint of a demon, and this gives a fresh look on some very old truths. First, we see that Lewis's decision to write the Screwtape Letters from the viewpoint of a demon allows him to enhance his theme by who admits that God conquers Satan. Screwtape does not want to lose the battle. His one and only goal is to gain human souls. We want cattle who can finally become food. We want to suck in. We are empty and would be filled. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below, Satan, has drawn all other beings into himself. And yet, he is the one who admits that Wormwood has, quote, let a soul slip through his fingers, unquote. He even admits that demons cannot win. This confession that God wins the spiritual battle comes from the least willing source, and thus is made all the more justified and true. Lewis is allowed to use this aspect to justify his theme because he chose to write the novel from the point of view of a demon. Furthermore, through his use of point of view, Lewis is able to exploit the thought processes of demons in order to enhance his theme. Lewis, through Screwtape, shows us the demon's inability to understand God's love for men. By mere carelessness, I slipped into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had this impossible love is our utter failure to find out that real motive. Considering this, along with the well-known fact that you cannot win a war unless you know your opponent's reasons for fighting, it is easy to see how Lewis subtly tells us that God wins this spiritual battle. He even says that if the demons could understand God's love, there would be no spiritual war at all. Members of God's faction have frequently admitted that if we ever came to understand what he means by love, the war would be over and we should re-enter heaven. It is only through Lewis's use of point of view that this clever emphasis on the theme is made possible to employ, and the book is much richer for it. I hope, my dear niece, that the Screwtape Letters makes more sense to you now, and that I have enlightened you in some small way to one of the book's themes. I encourage you to continue to dive into the novel itself and discover more truths that Lewis wove into this story. Keep looking for more elements of artistry and texture, like central focus, irony, and point of view that we talked about here. And always remember that God will win the spiritual war against Satan. Your affectionate aunt, Cassidy.